And with that, Ethan, I'm so excited to learn more about Wharton Esherick and industrial arts education after the Centennial Exposition. So
Thank you, Katie.
I'll turn
Thank
it
you.
over to
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
All right, I'll get my screen shared. So give me just a moment. All right, can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Okay, so good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I hope that everyone in the East or on the East Coast has enjoyed this huge blanket of snow that we've gotten. So, Happy New Year from the Wharton Esherick Museum, and welcome to our first Spotlight Talk of 2026. We're really thrilled to kick off an exciting season celebrating the centennial year of Wharton Esherick's 1926 studio. And to mark this milestone in Wharton Esherick's legacy, the museum is going to be exploring the theme of breaking ground throughout this year. And we'll be asking and exploring questions about how we envision, build, and change the world around us. So, in order to begin breaking ground in January of 2026, we're going to be exploring Wharton Esherick's early education in manual training and industrial art before he enrolled at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to receive his only formal artistic training as a fine artist. And some of the research from or for today's talk draws from my master's thesis, which explored a kind of growing industrial complex around the decorative arts after the centennial. And that included the development of many educational institutions for arts around the country. This is only a 20-minute talk, so we'll have some generalizations, but we can spend some time afterwards kind of digging into some nuances if people are interested. So, Wharton Esherick's time training as a fine artist at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts undoubtedly informs his artistic practice and the way that this artist approached everything he made, no matter how utilitarian, with an immense sense of creativity and expression. However, Esherick's time training first in manual education as a high school student and then as an industrial artist as a young college student likely helped him to further develop his drawing and sketching skills, both of which were lifelong practices that he began in early childhood. It likely supplied him with an early knowledge of different tools and trades and would have exposed him to a number of different mediums, processes, and skills that he would explore in his career a little later on. So, to roll it back a little bit, Esherick's early education and the Philadelphia environs that he grew up in were deeply informed by the 1876 Centennial Exposition that marked the country's 100th anniversary. While this year the country's cultural sector is largely preoccupied with America's 250th, folks in the late 19th century were pretty preoccupied with the centennial. All of these beautiful goods that they saw there, like this Swedish ornamental pottery that we see on the screen, and the kind of seemingly sorry state of America's industrial arts and skilled labor that seemed to pale in comparison to the international exhibitors at the Centennial. So the fact that the United States arts presentations were kind of put out to pasture caused a pretty great sense of anxiety around the country. And so to redress this issue and begin to improve the state of American manufacturing, there were a number of public museums, industrial arts institutions, and educational models centering mechanical and industrial skills that were getting developed in the years following the centennial to kind of promote American industry and to kind of balance some trade out as well. So Wharton Esherick was born 11 years after the fair closed and grew up only a couple miles south of the original fairgrounds in Fairmount Park. During Esherick's childhood around the turn of the 20th century, Philadelphia was growing into its epithet as the workshop of the world, and the country's educators, business people, workers, and consumers were advocating for and beginning to see investments and improvements in the industrial and applied arts. So, one of the more interesting areas that we see this investment, and one that had a direct impact on Esherick, is in the sphere of public education. So, this investment in arts education would naturally mean different things to different people. So, for the country's educators, it meant that this type of education could provide students with a more well-rounded education and skills for the industrial age that they were graduating into. And some educators even hoped that manual training could make strides in addressing wealth inequality by helping grow the country's skilled labor force. And for others, like business leaders and economists, investment in arts education was actually an issue of political economy. So, growing a skilled workforce at home was a way of addressing a trade and skill deficit that the Centennial really seemed to make present. So, Massachusetts was actually the kind of front runner in the country for arts education, and it was the first state to fund, incorporate, and require drawing in public institutions, beginning in 1870 after the passage of an act related to free drawing instruction. And many other states around the eastern seaboard, like Maine, New York, and Vermont, quickly followed suit to also introduce drawing and other arts education in their public schools. But an international exposition like the Centennial provided American educators with some important pedagogical inspiration from abroad. So the image that we're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen is a print of the Russian educational department at the Centennial. And it was an exhibition from the Imperial Technical School where they were highlighting this kind of newer type of education that they were using that was called tool education. And educators in America, specifically the presidents of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Washington University in St. Louis, were impressed enough with the Russian Education Department's exhibition that they took a cue and started to introduce forms of manual and technical training at their universities as well. And during the decade of the centennial, we also saw a number of other arts institutions established throughout the country, such as the Rhode Island Institute for Design, the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and the Art Student League of New York, as well as Wharton's alma mater, the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Arts. And the topic of manual training for younger students really quickly trickled down from higher ed to boards of education, teachers' conventions and teachers' unions, journals, and daily newspapers. And here we're just seeing a selection of, three of the hundreds and hundreds of periodicals and writings about art education for young students. So, arts education and manual training had already gained ground in Philadelphia when Wharton was reaching high school age. And some of the first schools in Philadelphia to actually formally introduce a kind of manual training into their curricula were first the Spring Garden Institute and then Girard College, both of which developed these programs a little bit before the centennial started. So by the middle of the 1880s, the Philadelphia School District opened the first of three manual training schools in the city, and this one is on 17th and Wood, and it is Wharton's alma mater, the Central Manual Training School. The city opened up another manual training school for high schoolers in the Northeast, as well as one for elementary school kids that mainly served a Black and immigrant community near 6th and Lombard that was named after James Wharton, the Philadelphia sailmaker. And by the end of the 19th century, when Wharton was heading into high school, children could also take low cost or free art classes at a number of independent art clubs throughout the city, such as the Philadelphia Sketch Club or Samuel Fleischer's graphic sketch club, known as the Samuel Fleischer Memorial today. So Esherick began attending the Central Manual Training High School in 1902 and graduated in 1906. What we're seeing here on the screen is his graduating class photo. I'm not sure what building that's taken in front of, but it looks like it could be the library on the Parkway, or it could be a building that just isn't in existence anymore. And Wharton recollected at the end of his life, through an interview with his daughter and son-in-law, that attending manual training school helped him to kind of circumvent a traditional grammar school education that was more focused on textbooks and memorization. And moreover, with reluctant parents like Wharton's, manual training could have, set their artistically inclined son up for work in a factory, designing or making, say, colonial revival furniture or jardinières, that would have earned him a regular paycheck, then relying on fine arts to make a living. And for a short time into the industrial arts, he went. Wharton worked for the Victor Talking Machine Company as well as the Philadelphia Ledger for a short time after his stint at the Pennsylvania Academy. Now, at the Central Manual Training High School, drawing was seen as like the most foundational skill for students to learn. Thus, Esherick had ample opportunities to refine his drawing skills as a high school student, and he remembers gaining some experience in the school's wood and blacksmith shops, as well as taking some modern language courses in French and German. So, the course of study at the Central Manual Training High School did indeed include more traditional education like modern languages and literature, history, mathematics, and science as well. However, it was the school's drawing and manual training departments that set it apart from other Philadelphia public schools so that they could train not only the student's mind, but also the hand as well. And coursework in drawing and manual arts would have spanned a student's entire 4 years in high school, and these studies would dovetail together for a large culminating project at the end of a student's 4 years. So, as I mentioned, drawing classes were a fundamental aspect of Edric's education. And within this pedagogy of manual training, drawing was seen as this most foundational skill. Philadelphia's Central Manual High School had three different drawing divisions. One was constructive drawing as a kind of foundation. Two was representative or freehand drawing that kind of focused on form and proportion, training the eye and hand. And lastly, a course in decorative and design drawing that was according to this pamphlet here, which described the curricula of Philadelphia's manual training, that was meant to cultivate students' taste as consumers and designers. So, manual training, on the other hand, included studies in tools, how they work, how to use them, how to care for them, and even how to make them. And this began with basic woodshop skills like using saws, chisels, planers, and mortisers, and creating something from a rough board. Later lessons in high school focused on wood turning tools, creating molds or patterns from wood that would later be brought to a foundry for casting in metal. Working in the blacksmith shop, drawing out, bending, and shaping metals, as well as welding. And then there was a course in making machine parts, like rings, chains, and bolts. Ultimately, all these skills were put to the test as students were tasked with creating their own set of chisels, tools, and wood turning equipment for use in their junior and senior years of high school. And the culminating project for high school students, according to that educational pamphlet, was that students had to create, quote, some manual or some mechanical construction embodying the principles that they had been dealing with and the practical ability that they had acquired. So imagine Wharton making some kind of, mechanical equipment that moves and things like that and can be articulated. And outside of his regular coursework, Wharton was involved in some extracurricular activities, such as playing baseball and serving as the chairman of the school's record committee. The Wharton Esherick Museum is really, really fortunate to steward two of the yearbooks from Wharton's alma mater from 1905 and '06, both of which Wharton helped to illustrate. And here we're seeing some of those illustrations that Wharton meant or made for the yearbook on the screen. So he started college at the Pennsylvania School for Industrial Arts in the fall of 1906 and attended this institution for 2 years before he received his scholarship to the Pennsylvania Academy, where he studied as a painter. And just like his time in high school, Wharton doesn't really spend too much time reflecting on his, period as an industrial arts student, but we can still dig in a little bit here. So Wharton mainly recollected about his time drawing at the Pennsylvania Museum School for Industrial Arts. And in his oral history, he describes spending a significant amount of time among the school's classical sculptures in their, quote, antiques department. And he also described a strange preoccupation with drawing the mouths of all these sculptures. It's possible that Esherick skipped out on some of his classes to do these sketches and drawings since he remembers being chided by the school's dean, who told him, Wharton, you're supposed to be in the watercolor department, or Wharton, you're supposed to be in the costume department. But Wharton's drawing teacher, Herman Digendish, whose life class we see here on the screen, and maybe some of those classical sculptures that Wharton was drawing in the back, continued to encourage Wharton to do these drawings and sketches, possibly at the expense of his other responsibilities that the dean was constantly reminding him of. So it's difficult to determine exactly what courses Esherick would have been enrolled in at the Pennsylvania Museum School outside of his general recollections from decades later, or if he was even there long enough to determine a course of study or a kind of concentration or major. School catalogs from 1906 and 1907, when Wharton was enrolled, give us a glimpse into kind of more traditional courses of study for students and the kind of required courses during Wharton's period of enrollment that he probably would have been exposed to. Moreover, we can start to see some direct connections between Esherick's later work and some of the studies that he may have been exposed to at the industrial school. So the Pennsylvania Museum School provided four courses of study for their students. One, normal art. Two, interior decoration. Three, applied arts. And four, illustration. Now, again, it's unclear which courses Esherick had enrolled in, but based on his recollections, it would suggest that he was taking many classes associated with the course of study in illustration. And if this was the case, Wharton studies required classes in antique and life drawings, like we saw on the screen prior with Herman Diekendish's class, which meant drawing live models in historic costumes, classes in decorative lettering, botanical drawing, anatomy, perspective and composition, and the like. As a freshman, Wharton would have also been required to attend weekly art history lectures and have had the opportunity to attend presentations on topics like color theory, illustrative processes, and anatomy as well. Students also had the opportunity and were encouraged to visit and study at the Associated Pennsylvania Museum, which is today known as the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as the Philadelphia Zoo, the Franklin Institute, and other institutions around the city. At the Pennsylvania Museum of Industrial Arts, which was then inside of Memorial Hall, students studied decorative arts from the collection that originated with purchases from the Centennial Exposition, and which by Wharton's time had been greatly built up through active collecting, donations, and loaned collections. And we can see from old catalogs and circulars of the museum that during Wharton's time as a student, they were actively accessioning and collecting antiquities, different types of carvings, ceramics, furniture, glass, jewelry, metalwork, musical instruments, and textiles. And the one remnant that we have in the collection from Wharton's time as an industrial art student is this art primer here on the screen about lead glazed pottery from 1907. So Esherick's later creative work was so remarkably wide in scope. It included painting, printmaking, building, book arts, furniture, design, etc., etc. And based on the sheer scope of Wharton's creative work, I think it's possible that he may have attended classes or studied examples of watercolor paintings, book bindings, industrial drawings, applied design, decorative sculpture, and architectural drawing and design, as well as woodworking in his 2 years at the Pennsylvania Museum School. So now I want to turn to some examples from our collection to show that Wharton's time training in the manual and industrial arts clearly informs his later work in a number of ways. And we'll see him bringing some of these skills and techniques that he learned as a young student into his later artistic practices. So one example of Esherick's early education informing his later work relates to the watercolors and pastels that he painted in the late 19 teens and early 20s and matted for exhibition. Here we see a couple of examples, including Bluff at Sunrise on the right, a watercolor from Fairhope, Alabama, and this lovely watercolor called Breakers that was likely painted on the Cape in the late 19 teens. And while the paintings themselves, of course, are the main event, I want to draw us to the lettering that Wharton executed at the bottom of the mat for each of these paintings that shows the title of the work and his name. So, learning lettering like this was a requirement of Pennsylvania Museum School students who were studying illustration, like Wharton may have been, in both their first and second years. So we know that later on, Wharton was studying different forms of typography and lettering that he was seeing in newspapers and magazines, and he was clipping them and saving them for his own records. But I think it's highly likely that Wharton would have been exposed to decorative lettering as a student and brought these skills into his artistic practice later on. So this work in lettering also informs some of Wharton's work in the book arts. Wharton illustrated over a half a dozen books and publications during his lifetime and was involved in actually kind of designing the books that he worked on for Philadelphia's avant-garde publisher Centaur Press. Wharton often created prototypes for these books by hand lettering the text, sewing the binding, and experimenting with covers, as well as drawing designs for prints right onto the pages, and experimentations with some lettering that we see here on the left. And what we're seeing is a sketchbook or prototype for Song of Solomon that was published by the Centaur Press in 1924 with Wharton's designs. So we can see the influence of Wharton's early education and exposure to industrial and manual arts in so many other parts of his creative life. And I wish we could cover all of them, but we would have to be here for weeks on end. So just a couple of examples. Up on the top left of the screen, we see one of a few examples of paper stencils that Wharton made and used for early printing that we have in our collection. And we know that students at at the museum school were required often, depending on their course of study, to actually take classes in designing and cutting and using stencils. Below that, we see a lovely measured design drawing for Wharton Esherick's 1929 flat top desk, which he made um, using many of the skills that he learned drawing and measuring. So what we're seeing here are kind of these technical design and measured drawings that helped Wharton as he was cutting out component parts for this furniture and working with John Schmidt, his cabinet maker, to fit it all together. In the center of the screen, we see one of the hundreds of examples of Wharton's model making, which he did for furniture, sometimes for sculpture, and a lot of time for interior decoration and architectural components. And that was something that he would not have learned in high school. Kind of architectural modeling was a little bit too advanced for manual students, but this was a skill that students at the Pennsylvania Museum School would have been exposed to as they were required to learn about architectural drawings, rendering, and three-dimensional modeling as well. And then my last example, which I think kind of harkens towards Esherick's early education, but also his tendency to approach everything he made with this sense of expression and intuition, is this imitation hammer handle on the right side of the screen. So if you're familiar with Wharton's hammer handle chairs, you might know that he bought a large hammer or a large barrel of hammer handles in the 1930s that he made dozens and dozens and dozens of chairs from using those prefabricated parts. In the 1950s, Wharton wanted to make another set of hammer handle chairs, but had run out of all the prefabricated hammer handles that he bought in Coopersburg, Pennsylvania. So he actually starts to make new hammer handles to create another set of hammer handle chairs. And this harkens back to that project that would have had as a high schooler in actually learning how to make tools. So learning how to make hammer handles would not have been something that was new to Wharton in the 1950s, but he would have been harkening back to something he learned as a high schooler, which I think is quite lovely. So training as an industrial artist, I think, aided Wharton in his understanding of tools, materials, and techniques, while this later education at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts seemed to help teach Esherick to approach his work with a particular kind of creativity. So to conclude today's presentation, I kind of want to spend just a moment kind of briefly reflecting on what it means to talk about art education at this particular moment when funding for the arts is being challenged and educational institutions like Wharton's alma mater are closing one day after the next. So, to me, reflecting on this moment in history and the history of arts education kind of clearly shows that there were once models for life where art and expression were much more integrated into our daily lives and thus seemed to help deem this kind of mix of art and life to be important enough that systems and structures around creativity and making were developed for people across the country. So I hope that, we can look towards this and learn about different models for ways that we can teach ourselves art and expression and build that into our daily lives in a way that we no longer do today. Um, so before we open it up for questions, I just want to let everyone know that we have our next Spotlight Talk up and ready. So it'll be on Tuesday, February 24th, same time at noon and same place here in the Zoom room. And we'll be covering this lovely print, February, that Wharton made in the early 20s, and his involvement with the WPA, who ultimately published this print as part of their American block print calendar in 1937. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can open it up for questions. I'm happy to go back to any slides that people want to see again if you want.
Thank you so much, Ethan. What an incredibly fascinating, like little snippet of history. And I love that you're positing this question of like, what does it mean to invest? As you were talking, I was thinking so much about the things that you might get exposed to in your high school and your young age that you don't realize, could come back to be valuable to you, 20, 30 years down the road. And, I don't know how much Esherick really he wasn't always the one who was articulating those things, but the way you tether that to um, tool making and stencil making and his book arts and all of those things later on is really fascinating.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, I don't know if other people have questions. I will say there's a lovely comment from Lisa Richardson that's in the chat. Um,
I have a question, Ethan.
Yeah.
I think, thank you for that. That was such a great kind of moment to delve into Wharton's strength in drawing, which I feel like is something that runs through so much of his work, and just seeing how ingrained it would have been in those early experiences. Um, but I want to pivot around a little bit to his studio, the 1926 studio, and the fact that he was very upfront with saying, "I never made any drawings for this building." It seemed like whether or not he did it, it was very important for him to talk about it as a building that did not have any drawings or plans for it. And I wonder what you make of that, and what might have brought that kind of up that idea about.
Oh gosh, that's a great question, Holly, and I don't even know where to begin. Um, I mean, in some sense, mm, yeah, no, you might have a different take, and we have 30 people in this room, and we might have 30 different takes on this question. But I think it's possible that it seems like after Wharton's time at PAFA, he really did kind of come out of that experience imbued with a certain sense of creativity and kind of willingness to take risks that we don't know that he was willing to before that. And I wonder whether he saw his studio then not as, a piece of industrial art or applied arts with, the stones that he was using or the colors that he was including, but more as a sculpture that, needed to be done on the fly rather than planned out. So it shows that he approached it more as a piece of art and sculpture than as a piece of like applied arts, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he would have maybe learned bricklaying in school. It's unclear whether students were learning that at his point in high school. I see we have a question from Jamie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if you were forced to speak in his voice today, what do you think he would say about educational needs in society in America today?
Hmm. Well, I can say that from Wharton's really early days, And by that, I mean like the earliest times that he's, recorded in newspapers for interviews and things like that. He was advocating for art education. And he in the late 19 teens or early 20s, after his first stint at the Fairhope Organic School, he had an article that was published about him that was mainly just a quote of him talking about the importance of art education for both white and black students in the segregated South. And I think that Wharton would be devastated to see his alma mater closing and many other arts institutions closing. However, it's curious because he was never someone who really taught himself. So he understood the importance of our education, but he himself did not want to be an educator necessarily.
Thank you.
Ethan, there's a couple of questions that
Yeah,
have popped up in the chat.
yeah, I see this here.
Jonathan,
Yeah, let me roll back. So Jonathan was asking if Wharton attended art classes with any other notable artists. I am not quite sure, and I think we'd have to look at some of the local Philadelphia artists working around Wharton's time and see kind of their history in arts education. But I do know that Wharton would have kind of run among more notable artists, arguably at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts than he might have been at the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Arts. And then can you show us the photo of Esherick's children on their bicycles? Yeah. So I think maybe Holly will be able to better answer the question about Wharton's siblings. But I'll go back to this lovely photo from Bob Bascom's biography here. And maybe Holly or Katie could speak a little bit more to the Esherick siblings.
I know the most about his twin sister Dottie, and I think that's who he's standing next to. People said that she was a very kind of conventional woman. She was not an artist, but that she and Wharton had a very close bond. And also Joe Esherick Sr., who was one of his brothers, who was an engineer, but then who was the father of Joe Esherick Jr., who became a very well-known architect on the West Coast. And also Margaret Esherick, who was Joe Jr. So Joe Sr. is the father of Joe Jr. and also the father of Margaret. And Margaret was a bookseller who commissioned the Margaret Esherick House from Louis Kahn in Chestnut Hill. So kind of some artistic nieces and nephews, I think, artistically inclined nieces and nephews in the family. But I don't know. I really don't know anything about the other siblings. Katie, do you?
I don't have anything to
Yeah.
add. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have a question for the group. We received an email last week about someone who was planning to attend who had actually gone to the Central Manual Training High School, and I'm wondering if they might be here in the room with us, or if anyone in the Zoom room may have attended either the Central Manual Training High School, the Northeast one, or the University of the Arts.
Then I would love, I'm so sorry, everyone. I am finishing some work up, so I'm not on video right now. But thank you so, so much for all of your organization and amazing words. Um, so my uncle went to Williamson, and I'm really curious if there, I'm also an organist as well, and it's really interesting to me to think about the music trends around like organ building during the same time, the sort of early 20s. And I really am very curious about the other school links that he was sort of adjacent to around the same times. Do you have any, did you come across any writings about that or any of his friends? I think the museum and sort of organizational and academic history of Philadelphia is just so interesting, especially all the transitions that happened, right? That the Museum of Industrial Art eventually became the Philadelphia Museum of Art, right? As we know it today, when it was relocated. I think the connections between all that are really wonderful. I don't really have a question, I guess. It's more of statement and reflect, but yeah.
Yeah, to try to answer that, I haven't been able to really see what Wharton's classmates were involved in quite yet. And obviously, all this research can, have avenues to continue. Um, but we definitely see, I guess, the transition of kind of Philadelphia institutions during Wharton's lifetime. So we see him making use of, the kind of industrial factories up in Old City to buy strap seating for chairs and other kind of component parts for furniture and sculpture. Um, but maybe the best way to answer your question, which I don't think necessarily answers it in the way that you want it to, but that, during Wharton's early artistic career, he is involved in New York galleries, and he develops a relationship with a gentleman named Carl Zagrosser, who was his print curator and print dealer in New York from the early 20s through the early 30s when he kind of stops printing altogether. And he continues that relationship with Carl Zagrosser as he becomes the first curator of prints and drawing at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So kind of we see those institutional changes on the periphery of Wharton's life with some of his associates, but I think a little bit less so directly with him.
Ethan,
Yeah.
this is Cynthia.
Hi,
Hi.
Cynthia. How you doing?
Good. I know that I read somewhere that Wharton felt that art should be incorporated into the home as part of the home
Hmm.
and not some fancy painting in a beautiful frame and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that came maybe from some of his training at the industrial arts or other
I
places?
think that that's possible. And just so everyone knows, Cynthia, what you're referencing is the article that I was talking about when Jamie asked their question. So that's like 1919 and Wharton saying that art shouldn't be on the walls of museums or churches, but it's something that we should be living with in our daily lives.
Mhm.
I think it could be influenced by his time at the Industrial Arts School, but by that point, Wharton's family had been pretty situated at their home in Paoli, that, it was their kind of idyllic farmland, Sunnycrest. And I think that that was probably the greatest opportunity by that point for the Esherick family to really experiment with taking art off the walls, and making it a part of their daily lives. So they had, sculptures of stork and frogs around their pond. Wharton had painted the walls inside their farmhouse with murals of farm animals. So it felt like, they were the ones inside the pen. So I think that that was really maybe where we first see that glimpse of art and life coming together. But it's hard to say exactly where it came from, that kind of desire. And we can be sure to share that article in the follow-up email so everyone can take a look at Wharton's lovely words
Yeah,
about how
that's
art
good.
should be.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Well, unless anyone else has any questions, we hope that we'll see you next month for the Spotlight Talk in February about the print February. And you can also head to our website. We have some of our spring programs up. You can check them out if you're interested. And then we'll also be debuting our tour calendar. And I'm going to pass that off to Katie, who will be the final say on when that is.
Well, so as many of you know, we're closed to the public through the month of February. Our tours resume in March, which is what Ethan is mentioning. Those tours should be bookable by the end of this month. And as Ethan is mentioning, we have the upcoming Spotlight Talk. We also have a bunch of amazing programs this spring. If you haven't heard us talk about it yet, I'll mention now that 2026 marks 100 years of Esherick breaking ground on his studio. And so we are doing a lot to really celebrate the founding of that building and all of the creative work that founding it made possible. So I won't go through the whole list of programs right now. I'll say go to our website if you're interested, and also sign up for our mailing list if you're not already, because we will tell you all about the good stuff that we have planned